Of course, once this happens, I issue a report to the United Nations. I was asked by an African NGO in Israel to put together, to document all of this state-sponsored racism, and I did so. And the UN responded by agreeing with my findings and stating that the government must strike down this law that criminalizes Africans, and that it must condemn these statements, these racist statements by political and religious leaders. Of course, the government did no such thing, completely ignored it. And the following month, you have full-scale anti-African violent vigilante attacks. You have Israelis firebombing 6-7 African people's homes in a single night in Tel Aviv. Even an African kindergarten, if you can imagine that. I'm going to come back in a few minutes to the story of the African kindergarten that was firebombed. But first, let's move on. Of course, the next day there were Jewish Israelis who came out in the streets and protested and were incensed by this sick racism and demanded an end to it and protection for the African asylum seekers. But for their troubles, these Israelis who stand in solidarity with Africans are hated even more than the Africans themselves, if that's possible. Completely marginalized. They are a tiny fraction of the population and despised for doing so. And the month that follows, you have every other day an African man is stabbed or shot, or another anti-African rally. And then May 23, 2012, you have full-scale anti-African pogrom in Tel Aviv. Here, this woman designed a personalized t-shirt, tank top saying, Mavet LaSudanim, death to the Sudanese. And of course, again, Michael Ben-Ari comes up to the mic and incites racism and riles people up and gets them going. But he wasn't the only one. There were several members of Knesset from the ruling Likud party who got up there and just drove people over the edge and inciting crazy racism against Africans, including Miri Regev, who called Africans cancer. And hearing this, it just sent people into just over the edge, and you had 1,000 Israelis running rampant through the streets of Tel Aviv, attacking any dark-skinned person they came across, stopping buses. Hey, do you have any African people in here? Get them out. Let's get them. Smashing any vehicle that had African people in it. This woman, they bashed her over the head with a beer bottle and threw her child to the ground. And of course, any cafe or restaurant operated by African people smashed and looted. And so you'd think that after this orgy of violence, that after this outpouring of racism, people would have, taken stock of what had happened and looked at themselves in the mirror and said, how did we come to this point? And, we breathe deeply. We need to reflect and how we can prevent this from happening again. Forget about it. If anything, the racism just redoubled. And in the days that followed, you just have this insane scene of African people marching to the UN offices in Tel Aviv saying, we need protection, help, we're being attacked in the streets. And we're humans, we're not cancer, we're humans. I'm hard-pressed to think of some other situation where people have to assert that they are in fact human beings and not a cancer. And this wasn't a marginal statement. In the days that followed, a poll by the Israel Democracy Institute found that over half of Israeli Jews agreed with that statement that touched off the race riot. That 52% agreed Africans are cancer. And 33%, a third of Israeli Jews, supported the vigilante violent attacks on Africans that night. In the same week that followed the race riot, you have rabbis in Bnei Brak issuing a new religious edict calling Israelis who are in solidarity with Africans a rodef. Now, what does that mean? You may recall in 1995, the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, was assassinated. He was assassinated by a Jewish Israeli, right? And he did so because racist rabbis issued a similar edict calling Rabin a Rodef, saying he is evil, he deserves to die. If anyone out there assassinates him, there's no punishment for that. You get off scot-free. And so some Israeli Jew went out and killed Rabin on the basis of this religious edict. And so now you have rabbis issuing the same edict of Rodef to apply to any Israeli that's in solidarity with African asylum seekers. In the weeks that followed, you had ambassadors from 6 African nations appeal to the foreign ministry, please put a stop to this. Stop inciting racist violence against Africans. We can't walk out in the street. We're not safe. Our wives can't go shopping. We can't leave our homes without being accosted. The deportations begin in the summer of 2012. So the first group to go are the South Sudanese. You may recall that at this point a new nation is formed. Sudan and South Sudan separate. And the government says, now you've got your own country to go back to, you can leave. You must leave. And people were pleading, please just let us stay a little while longer. It's not safe. But the government, of course, was insistent, and they had to go back, even though, you know, half the people in South Sudan didn't even have access to clean drinking water at this point. And sure enough, within 10 days of the first group of deportees getting back to South Sudan, they started dropping like flies. Kids dying of diseases that easily could have been treated in any Israeli hospital, but now they're back in South Sudan without any kind of infrastructure. They were dying. These kids who, born in Israel, spoke perfect Hebrew, but as far as Israel was concerned, they were foreigners and deserved to be deported. Now remember that African kindergarten that was firebombed I told you about? So by the end of the year, by December, in the same month, Israel deported back to Africa the man who'd opened up this kindergarten, providing a safe space for refugee kids. And in the very same month, they exonerated the man. Well, I shouldn't say exonerated. He got a couple months of community service, but didn't serve a day in jail. The man who firebombed that African kindergarten, if you can imagine that. So December 2012, up until this point, there isn't any serious physical barrier between Egypt and Israel. There's a vast desert, but now the government wants to end this migration of African asylum seekers, so it spends billions of shekels and builds this fence along the border. And it completes the fence in December 2012. And so Benjamin Netanyahu comes out there and examines the fence and, you know, praises those who built it, and is proud to announce that now we have ended the African migration to Israel. There's no more Africans entering the country. And now we're going to enter stage 2, which is kicking out all the Africans that are already in the country, those 60,000 that managed to immigrate in that time, up until that point. And while he didn't mention it, I should also point out that many of those men who worked welding the fence, putting it up, were themselves African. Without many economic opportunities, they were forced to take whatever job was available. In December 2012, New Year's Eve, there's a headline in Israeli newspapers: 80-year-old Israeli woman raped by African man. And of course, the news of this just drives people insanely angry, you know? And people are incensed that a Jewish woman has been defiled by a non-Jewish man, you know, and they're out in the streets again demanding that all Africans be deported immediately because of the action. There may be action, you know. I don't know about innocent till presumed guilty, but here someone's been accused of a crime, and on the basis of that, the people are baying for blood and demanding that all Africans be deported from the country. Now, it was interesting because this event happened exactly 100 years after this other seminal event. You may have heard of the story of Leo Frank. So this man, he owned a factory in the United States, and a young girl who worked in that factory was raped and murdered. And he was accused of the crime, and he was brought to trial. We don't know, did he do it or didn't he? We won't know, because before the court passed sentence, people broke into his jail cell and lynched him because he was Jewish. And this idea that the white race was defiled by a Jewish man, potentially, just drove people over the edge. And because of that event, the ADL was formed. The Anti-Defamation League was founded in 1913 because of the case of Leo Frank, to prevent this from happening again, this mob violence, this intense, these racist hatred campaigns directed towards minority communities. And that's why this group was supposedly established. But today, it's no longer an anti-hate group. It's a hate group. Because here, in 2013, last year, in the entire year of its centennial, the Anti-Defamation League did not issue even a single condemnation or word of criticism for the Israeli government because of its war on African asylum seekers. They didn't have a single word to say the entire year. And it wasn't only Abe Foxman. It was pretty much across the board. With the exception of Jewish Voice for Peace, maybe, there wasn't any major mainstream Jewish organization who stood up and criticized and demanded an end to Israel's war on Africans. And it really stands out in stark contrast to these groups' positions on immigration to America, because consistently Jewish groups are the loudest in their vocal support for immigration reform to this continent, and strong advocates for a leniency towards undocumented Americans. But here in North America, it plays out to their advantage because Jews are in the minority. So increased tolerance, multicultural society is good for Jewish people. It protects them. But in Israel, they don't need that protection because ethnically, Jews are the largest group in Israel. They're in the majority, so they don't need minority rights to be respected. So these groups are silently supporting Israel's war on African asylum seekers. And what is this demographic threat they're so afraid of? Even if you count all the African asylum seekers in the country, they only amount to 0.7% of the population. And so now we're at the beginning of 2013, and there are once again national elections. Netanyahu runs for the prime ministership once more, and now he's campaigning on the basis of his war on Africans. So you have this campaign poster, Atzirat Gala Mistanenim Sinai, we stop this wave of infiltrators from the Sinai. Vote for the Likud party. And there's so much political currency to be made from anti-African racism that, sure, he comes back to power as prime minister, but it's not only on the national level, even on the local level. So imagine, if you would, walking down the streets and being confronted with a poster such as this. To keep those Jews far from my daughter, I'm voting Christian identity for city council. I hope this never exists. This is completely fictitious. I made this in Photoshop, okay? But this does exist in real life. In Hadera, there is a poster that says exactly the same thing, but directed towards Africans, not Jews. And I should point out that this party, who ran on the basis of this platform, they got into power, okay? And it's not only in small towns or little villages, even in the supposed liberal bubble of Tel Aviv, I couldn't walk 30, 40 meters outside my apartment without being confronted with this poster. And again, I've translated it into English for your benefit. God hates lust. Christians don't date Jews. Christians date Christians. Jews go home. This is what I have to see when I walk outside my apartment. Of course, it's directed to non-Jews in the Hebrew version.